Today, we are talking about Project X, which is basically the PlayStation Portal from China. Except there's one major difference here. While the PlayStation Portal relies on an internet connection and streams games, this one plays them natively. Kind of. I posted a picture of it online and people were pretty curious about it, so I figured, you know what, today we'll take a look at this device that actually comes in under $40. So if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe if you're new. Just looking at the box, it's pretty obvious where their inspiration came from for this system. The PlayStation symbols around the box mimic the Portal's packaging, with things mostly just flipped around with where square and triangle are. On the bottom, we have a Project X logo, and on the side, we have a warning that reads, "Due to the characteristics of the LCD, there are some dots that do not light up or that never turn off. However, please take note that this is not a defect." I mean, it sounds like they just described what most people would consider a defect, but all right. On the top, there is a note that reads, "Because the product itself, software occupies part memory, buy the memory and actual available memory under 20% of normal within." It sounds like they're trying to explain that you won't get the full advertised storage because the OS takes up a chunk of data, I think. Anyway, let's open this thing up. The handheld is front and center inside a bag and surrounded by plastic. A quick look underneath, we have a mini HDMI cable for video out, a USB-C to USB-A charging cable, and some instructions. With the Project X handheld out of the packaging, my first impressions aren't great. The glossy plastic was the first thing that stands out here to me, since it's covering about 2/3 of the device. I'm not sure if this is still seen as premium or if it's cheaper to manufacture, but glossy plastic just does not age well, and I could already see it collecting fingerprints immediately. I guess a positive is it does provide solid grip when using the system, but matte black plastic with a simple texture around the back would work fine as well. As for the layout, on the side is a D-pad that takes after the DualSense controller, at least in look. When you start pressing down on directions, you realize right away that it's actually has more in common with Nintendo's Joy-Con. See, these are all separate buttons, meaning when you press one, none of the others are affected. This makes rolling between directional inputs for something like a fighting game practically impossible. You just end up running into the side of the adjacent arrow. It's fine for platformers, but to call this a true D-pad is just incorrect. On the right side, we have A, B, X, and Y. Start and select are at the top, and at the bottom on opposite sides of the screen are two analog sticks that have similar travel to the Joy-Cons. At the top are shoulder buttons, as you would expect, with R1, R2, L1, L2. They're tactile, so you do get a nice click when you press down on them, and I really didn't have any issues using them in games, other than an accidental press here and there when I was getting used to just how close together they are. Along the top is the power button, volume rocker, USB-C port, micro USB port. This can be used, by the way, for an external controller for multiplayer, HDMI port, and the SD card slot. On the back are two speaker grills, which isn't a great spot for them. See, in this setup, what you'll end up with is a muffled sound, since it's being projected away from you rather than towards you. Also, if you have larger hands, you could actually cover up parts of the speaker grill by accident and further distort the sound when playing games. Turning it on, the system flashes a bunch of games that you'll never play on it before it stops on a menu screen. It's pretty straightforward with the different systems to pick from and a row of applications at the bottom. This includes things like a calculator, stopwatch, music, video, Internet Explorer, themes, and more. Also, I noticed that select when navigating the menu is B and cancel is A, which is completely opposite when you're in a game. It led to a lot of mispressing when moving between games and the menu, and it's just a weird thing to have to deal with in the first place. As for different systems, we can see arcade, NES, SNES, GBA, Game Boy, Genesis, and PS1 games. There's a separate selection on the bottom right for picking games from your SD card. For this video, I'm going to stick to just taking a look at games that come on the system out of the box, which is pretty much a random mishmash of titles. Total memory available here appears to be 4.7 gigabytes shown in the settings, down from the advertised 8 gigabytes, but they cover that before opening the box with that very clear message. Okay, so before I load up some games, let's let's go over what exactly is powering this thing. Inside, we have the ATM7051H, which is a quad-core chipset that is low-powered enough to not require any real cooling. It's paired with 256 megabytes of DDR3 memory, so we are looking at a fairly limited experience when it comes to emulation. For the most part, I found that 8-bit games like NES and Game Boy worked fine. Game Boy Advance was a bit more of a case-by-case situation, with some working well, while others had bouts of slowdown and audio that couldn't quite keep up. Even Super Nintendo games had some issues. F-Zero, for example, struggled the whole way, and while it is a bit more complex using Mode 7, I feel like we've gotten past asking if Super Nintendo games work on these emulation handhelds. Unfortunately, PS1 is just about unplayable. Tekken 3 is the one game on the system, and it runs at what feels like half speed. Obviously, a fighting game is going to be rough to play like this, but it's pretty clear this isn't a handheld to pick up for anything beyond, we'll say, 16-bit games. The screen doesn't do these games any favor either, with colors being washed out, and even at the highest brightness setting, it's still fairly dim. The bezels also seem to cut off the top and bottom parts of the LCD, and unless you change the LCD settings in the emulation menu, it'll stretch everything to a weird-looking aspect ratio. I tried using the analog sticks a few times, but there's really no reason to use them since PS1 games don't work well, and you would basically just use the D-pad buttons for everything else. These blue lights on the front actually look pretty nice in person, but they also seem to have a mind of their own. When I put the system to sleep, the left light would just stay on for some reason, which probably isn't great for a battery that's already struggles to get past 4 hours. While this handheld has been fairly underwhelming so far, I do want to point out something that it does right. That's the form factor. This is a good shape and setup for a handheld. I know people laughed at the PlayStation Portal when it was first shown, since it's pretty much a DualSense split in half with a screen in the middle, but that's actually a comfortable device to use. Project X, while attempting to mimic the idea of the Portal, seemed to come up with a form factor that also works well in a practical sense. I think there are better handhelds out there when it comes to portability, sure, but the way the grips jut out at the bottom with this landscape configuration, it does fit in the hand really well. Anyway, with that said, let's crack this handheld open, and when you turn it off, it just says bye-bye. On the back are 8 Phillips head screws that, along with some clips, hold the shell together. The clips are pretty strong, and they do give it a more solid feel at least, so there isn't much creaking when you try to bend the handheld. Using a spudger, I was able to separate the back and realized very quickly that the 2 speakers were soldered to the board and then attached to the back with adhesive. It's pretty obvious the internals are designed to be as cost-effective as possible, with no plug-in clips being used for the battery or speakers. The 2500 milliamp hour battery is glued to the back of the board. I don't think anyone would look to replace this battery due to the price of the system, but doing so means you would need to break out a soldering iron. The screen is on the other side, and thankfully it is clipped down to the board, so it's modular and somewhat reminds me, actually in form, of the PSP screen. You can see the D-pad and face buttons here, and there really isn't much of a difference at all. We are indeed dealing with just 4 buttons disguised as a D-pad in this system, which is a shame. The analog sticks are also soldered down, so if you experience any sort of drift or faulty parts, it's probably not worth even looking into replacing. The cluster of storage, CPU, and RAM is located on the top of the board behind the screen. I noticed there is a spot on the left side where rumble motor pads are set up, along with a large opening in the handle to attach one to the casing. Another spot where I'm sure cost savings won out. The board itself is at least fairly thick, and the face button connections are solid. I never felt like any inputs were off when jumping or attacking in games, and it makes sense seeing these solid connections. There's not really much to say about the inside of the system other than it lines up with the price point. Keeping to one board with a cheaper, low-powered processor while soldering all major components possible to the board is all working towards a system that's just, well, cheaply built. But that's going to do it here for Project X. What a strange device that really isn't worth picking up, but you know what? I do think they have something here if they want to completely redesign just about everything inside of the shell, which again is pretty good ergonomically, but for the market currently and where we are with other emulation devices that aren't too much more expensive than this one, I'd probably recommend a number of other handhelds before we even got to Project X. But hey, let me know what you guys thought about this one down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.